Thank you for sitting down again and for getting ready for our last session of the evening. Yes, I should mention, let me just explain to you a little bit about tonight. We are having a reception upstairs in the courtyard. As soon as this session is over, there is food. Hooray! But I need to explain, do not sneak out of the session and expect to come back to the party because they will be locking the doors of the museum at 7 o'clock. Our reception starts at 7 o'clock. So if you are not in the building at 7 o'clock, you will not be able to get into this party. It's very exclusive for that reason. Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, I love it. You're going to have to send that to me. So Garth Johnson, speaking about this. Thank you.
All right, are you guys ready for some vocational education? Oh, yeah. All right, so the title of my lecture is A Hackerspace of One's Own Curriculum and the Maker Movement. And I'd like to start it out with an amazing quote that I ran into from Sean McDougall, and that is, a Victorian teacher would get the hang of a modern school quite easily. And I'm going to follow that up by showing you guys a video clip from 1949. This is a little educational video called Let's Go to High School. And I think maybe this clip would be...
Some of the fellas who are planning to take the industrial course really opened their eyes at the shops we saw. The boys were glad to see the girls learning how to make those pies in homemaking class. The general course has a lot of interesting subjects in it. Some of us visited the special high schools. One was a technical high school. It has wonderful laboratories. Even the girls in the junior high school shops seem to like learning a little about electricity. Joe said all the boys and girls liked Martha because even though she could work with tools just as well as a lot of the boys, she never tried to show off. Most of Joe's teachers seemed to be swell. He said Mr. Palumbo, their radio teacher, had a grand sense of humor and was awfully fair. When Joe told me that the boys learned to use a sewing machine. In his school, you would just have to learn everything. It's pretty important for everybody to learn to sew, I guess. My sisters can make their own clothes, and I know it saves Mom and Dad money.
All right, I'll leave it to Sandra Alfoldi or Maria Busek to unpack a lot of the stuff in there. But I wanted to start out with a little paragraph. Education is in crisis. Students are ill-prepared for entry into the job market with its rapidly evolving skill sets. Employers requiring skilled workers are having a hard time finding qualified applicants who meet their needs. Secondary and post-secondary education is too narrowly focused on academics and not responsive enough to the needs of a majority of students and future employers. So this probably sounds familiar to a lot of your ears, but the preceding statements reflect the sentiments of the early 1900s, and this was a time of intense turmoil in the realm of education. The factory system had largely destroyed the system of apprenticeship that had served the nation as a source of skilled labor, and World War I cut off the flow of highly skilled European artisans who had been immigrating to the U.S. en masse. This educational crisis led to the passage of legislation like the Smith-Hughes Vocational Educational Act of 1917, which built on the efforts of career and technical education pioneers like Booker T. Washington, by providing funding for separate vocational schools governed by boards separate from state boards of education. From the beginning, academics and theoreticians sparred over the role that vocational education should play in students' lives. All right. So our story begins with a grudge match whose central issues still reverberate through the world of vocational education, and henceforth I'm going to refer to it by its more expansive modern name, career and technical education. Charles Prosser was a former high school superintendent who became interested in providing manual training to help reform juvenile delinquents. He was the architect of the Smith-Hughes Act, and he firmly believed in the separation of traditional and vocational schools. He was a firm believer in a kind of social economic Darwinism that valued preparing compliant workers for their proper role within society and advocated for student learning to be as much like the workplace as possible. And John Dewey was a philosopher, psychologist, social activist, and he disagreed with Prosser's approach. He believed that any factory that didn't spark worker interest and encourage growth represented mindless drudgery. In contrast to Prosser's indoctrinational approach, he believed that workers should possess the same training as their supervisors, which would encourage social mobility and growth. His methods would stress teaching students the process of reflective thinking and giving them the confidence to make their own intelligent choices. Dewey's core belief was that hand skills prepared an individual for problem solving in life, not for life within a factory system. So these competing worldviews came to define the yin and the yang of career and technical education throughout the 20th century. Vocational education flourished throughout most of the 20th century as Congress continued to fund land-grant universities and secondary schools alike throughout tough economic events like the Great Depression and World War II. Generations of American students grew up with a robust education in wood and metal shop, which flourished hand in hand with a tinkering culture built around popular mechanics and DIY that's in its original form, which pertain more to sort of household improvements. So vocational education arguably reached its zenith in the 1960s and 70s when well-funded high schools were flush with programs like auto body and small engine repair, drafting, machining, and of course home economics. So in his new book, Makers, Wired magazine author, editor, and former, Wired magazine editor, he left his post last week, Chris Anderson, recalls his 70s high school workshop class in suburban Washington, D.C. I love this quote. It's a place where the bad kids made ninja throwing stars. The worst made bongs. I made a crude magazine stand that my parents tolerated until I left home. I was lucky to have kept all my fingers through the process. Meanwhile, girls were steered to home economics to learn about sewing, cooking, and planting, which was, in a sense, another form of required crafting and DIY education. So my own experiences in shop class in the early 1980s reflected the rather Prosserian views of my shop teacher. I was given cookie cutter plans for a metal toolbox along with everyone else in my class. And the resulting monstrosity with its sharp edges and mismatched rivets only taught me about my own inadequacies when it came to working with my hands. It certainly didn't teach me the kind of manual intelligence that Richard Sennett or Matthew B. Crawford rhapsodize about. So my own unenthusiastically produced toolbox could serve as a metaphor for the fortunes of shop class during the 80s and 90s. In California, where I currently teach, 80% of the industrial arts/technology courses in secondary schools have been mothballed. During this time, the high school dropout rate has predictably risen as well. Deputy Superintendent Patrick Ainsworth of the California State Department of Education placed the dropout rate for secondary students enrolled in 2004 and 2005 at roughly 30%, while students enrolled in career and technical education experienced a dropout rate of only 16%. So the amount of equipment being jettisoned by downsizing shop programs is staggering. My father, whose manual intelligence sadly was not passed on to me, restores antique gasoline engines as a hobby. Over the past decades, he's amassed a collection of mothballed high school shop equipment that would make the producers of Hoarders blush. In 2005, in a lecture to the National Education Summit on High Schools, Microsoft founder Bill Gates gave us this now oft-repeated soundbite. America's high schools are obsolete. By obsolete, I don't just mean that our high schools are broken, flawed, and underfunded, though a case could easily be made for every one of those points. By obsolete, I mean that our high schools, even when they're working exactly as designed, cannot teach our kids what they need to know today. Training the workforce of tomorrow with the high schools of today is like trying to teach kids about today's computers on a 50-year-old mainframe. It's the wrong tools for the times. So it's been a long time since career and technical education outgrew the stereotypes of woodshop and home economics, despite or maybe because of the assessment-heavy academic initiatives like No Child Left Behind. There's clearly a demand for career and technical education on a secondary level. Modern legislation, including the Carl D. Perkins Vocational and Technical Education Act of 1998, mandates that CTE programs closely align with academic standards in each state. The Perkins Act also tasked CTE with using career-oriented programs to supplement and support traditional academic skills. So the Perkins Act proved to be so popular with legislators that it was reauthorized almost unanimously by Congress in 2006. And the Obama administration's 2013 budget includes an additional $1 billion in funding to help an additional 500,000 high school students, and that's a 50% increase, participate in career academies that would combine college curricula with a career emphasis. However, as of the election, no actual legislation has been drawn up, and no sponsors for that bill have come forward. There's clearly a mismatch between training being given to secondary school students and the needs of the marketplace. According to the National Academy's report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm Revisited, our nation's outlook in terms of innovation and the human capital has worsened. In 2009, 51% of United States patents were awarded to non-U.S. companies. In 2000, the number of foreign students in the U.S. graduate physics and engineering schools surpassed the number of U.S. students for the first time. So in Makers, Chris Anderson writes convincingly about the maker movement and the new industrial revolution that's at hand. He sums up the history of 2 decades of innovation in 2 sentences. The past 10 years have been about discovering new ways to create, invent, and work together on the web. The next 10 years will be about applying those lessons to the real world. So in other words, for the past 10 years, we've been focusing on virtual worlds, but online commerce still accounts for less than 10% of all sales. In the next 10 years, manufacturing will shift from large companies and large scales to decentralized manufacturing by millions of individuals on a small scale. Today, there are nearly 1,000 makerspaces, and they're also referred to as hackerspaces. You'll find out a little bit more about those in the next lecture. And in these makerspaces, makers share fabrication equipment like CNC mills, 3D printers, and laser cutters. In a sense, the makerspace is the shop class of the information age. So traditional CTE, career and technical education, is working to bring student skills in line with the marketplace. The Association of Career and Technical Education commits much of its efforts to fostering CTE skills in middle schools and secondary schools. The ACTE has taken a position in line with John Dewey's philosophy that calls for the holistic preparation of every American high school student for full participation in a spectrum of post-secondary education opportunities, meaningful work, career advancement, and active citizenship. So one of the ACTE's highest goals, is to create incentives for students to pursue the core curriculum in an interest-based context. So in other words, educators are encouraged to combine academic skills like writing or scientific study with real-world contexts like writing business proposals or exploring day-to-day work that chemists or biotechnologists do. Learning's made relevant to every student's course of study. The State Career Clusters Initiative has created knowledge and skill statements for 87 career pathways that fall within 16 career clusters, representing broad specters of the U.S. workforce. As opposed to offering career and technical education to the non-college bound, present-day CTE programs see 65% of students who take a concentration of career-themed classes go on to college immediately after high school. So design has become the interdisciplinary magic bullet for CTE education, allowing students to move beyond the kit-made birdhouse or toolbox and incorporate research methodologies, problem solving, and craftsmanship into projects that bear tangible fruit. And one shining example, one that Julie and Jennifer showed, and that's also been talked about other times today, is Studio H. It's a high school program founded in the underprivileged community of Bertie, North Carolina in January 2008 by Emily Pilliton and Matthew Miller. Studio H serves high school students, teaching them through practical community-based projects. During the 3-year tenure of Studio H in Bertie, students planned and built projects ranging in size from small chicken coops to a farmer's market for their county. Pilliton and Miller's student-driven success is described on their website thusly. Students will learn through a nonlinear design process which includes ethnographic research, generations of multiple sometimes crazy ideas, development of a few of those ideas into workable concepts, prototyping of those potential solutions, iterative refinement, and finally the construction and implementation of the solution. The process is messy, creative, surprising, and human-centered, resulting in solutions that emerge from need and community interest rather than schematic form-making. An iterative process, which usually includes multiple rounds of prototype refining, distills concepts into working solutions through testing and user feedback. So true to their open source community-oriented philosophy, Studio H makes their lesson plans available on their website. And after 3 years of running Studio H in Bertie with no support from the local school board, Piloton and Miller moved the headquarters of the studio to the Realm Charter School in Berkeley, California in August 2012. So even though they've left Bertie, their original students have now graduated from high school, and each have become agents of change in their own right. Project Lead the Way, PLTW, is a nonprofit CTE organization that's become a leading provider of innovative and rigorous STEM, and that's science, technology, engineering, and math curriculum to public schools. PLTW uses design methodology and real-world projects to promote critical thinking, creativity, and problem-solving skills in students. And the project was launched in 1997 in 12 high schools in upstate New York as a way to channel students into post-secondary engineering programs, and it's grown to include more than 4,700 schools that offer in their courses in all 50 states and here in the District of Columbia. PLTW's programs cover a wide range of disciplines that students would otherwise not have been exposed to, including aerospace, energy, modeling, robotics, technology, engineering, even a biosciences program that explores cell biology, genetics, disease, and other biomedical topics. Since its founding, Project Lead the Way has partnered with over 100 leading universities and colleges, as well as corporations ranging from Intel and CAD software maker Autodesk to defense contractor Lockheed Martin. Students have created a range of design solutions through their coursework that have even led to patents and the creations of small businesses. So finally, out of my 3 examples, and maybe most relevant to the maker movement, are the efforts of the Hackerspace Foundation. And Hackerspace was founded by Make Magazine founder Dale Doherty and Saul Griffith of Other Lab as a way of affordably putting technological tools like CNC routers, laser cutters, and 3D fabricators into the hands of students. Hackerspace was founded with many of the same goals as Project Lead the Way, but has never aligned explicitly with career and technical education. One chief difference between Hackerspace and PLTW is the built-in community that the maker movement brings. So Make Magazine, for those of you who don't know, it was founded in 2005, and it's sort of a 21st century answer to what popular mechanics meant to the generation that came of age in the 1940s and 50s. So the magazine brought hobbyists together with professionals who longed to combine high-tech solutions with low-tech workarounds and MacGyver ingenuity. So one famous early Make project involved converting a video cassette recorder into a cat feeder, and that uses the VCR's programmable timer and its mechanical guts. The underlying ethos of the movement is based on open source technology and transparent collaborations. So the members of the movement quickly harnessed their powers of community to work toward fostering their values among students, thus ensuring the movement's survival as well as dovetailing with efforts to promote STEM education. And incidentally, a new letter has sort of come into the STEM acronym, and that is an A for arts. So science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. The recently released President's Council Advisors on Science and Technology report states that the problem is not just a lack of proficiency among American students, there's also a lack of interest in STEM fields among many students. Perhaps the key to student engagement can be found in projects like the VCR cat feeder. The movement has grown faster than anyone could have hoped. Over the past 5 years, Make has hosted a Maker Fair that now draws over 80,000 people in the Bay Area of California. Maker Fair has now expanded to include events in Detroit and New York, as well as dozens of mini Maker Fairs throughout the world. So as the Hackerspace effort gains inertia, the issue of funding has arisen. The Foundation's organizers recently wrote a grant to fund the creation of 1,000 Makerspaces in high schools over the next 3 years. Some of the goals of the expanded program include working with engineering students and science educators to develop teachers' guides for make projects that will help educators integrate making into their own curriculum. All materials that we develop under the program will be made available for free under a Creative Commons license. Develop modular specifications for low-cost makerspaces in educational settings. We want to encourage schools to establish makerspaces, so we're providing some basic guidelines on the costs of getting started. Building a collaborative online platform that can be used by teachers and students to select projects, monitor progress, and generate student documentation for their own work. The platform will allow students to work beyond their own classrooms with other students and mentors. Integrate the new design tools for CAD and CAM that help students become familiar with 3D design and personal fabrication. And finally, prototype a low-cost, open-source CNC machine that can be affordable for schools to use. And also showcasing the work of students at maker fairs and bringing students together to meet each other and other makers in the community. So here's where it gets interesting. In 2011, Makerspace's mentor program was funded by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, to you and me. And as you might guess, that created sharp divides within the movement. Prominent community members, led by prominent hacker and inventor Mitch Altman, severed ties with Make and Makerspace over the decision to accept funding from the Pentagon. Altman raised the question of the role of government alongside hackers and educators. So just as with Lockheed Martin's involvement in Project Lead the Way, Makerspace is clearly in the interest of DARPA, which has a history of fostering innovations that benefit the defense industry, no matter how long-term. So as anyone from DARPA will readily tell you, their research led directly to the creation of the internet, as well as the stealth fighter and the assault rifle. Makerspace founder Dale Doherty defended DARPA funding in a post on Make's website. And he said, "We were motivated to apply for the DARPA grant by the following statement that was part of the mentor program. One of the biggest challenges we face as a nation is the decline in our ability to make things. Dr. Regina Dungan, the director of DARPA, the mentor program, we believe, gives us a framework to develop educational materials for high school and to promote the practice of making inside of schools." So he goes on to point out the connections between DARPA and many top universities, including MIT, which, as Doherty points out, has produced more than its share of hackers. So how does all of this relate to craft? I'm going to turn to another Chris Anderson quote from Makers. And incidentally, last week, Chris Anderson left his post as the editor of Wired, and he's putting his money where his mouth is and focusing on a 3D startup that he's working on. But in Makers, Anderson says, "Real countries make stuff. A service economy is all well and good, but eliminate manufacturing and you're a nation of bankers, burger flippers, and tour guides. Software and information industries get all the press, but they employ just a small percentage of the population." So manufacturing, the very thing that craft uses as a measuring stick and defines itself against, and we've sort of heard iterations of this throughout the day, is about to go through a major shift that will redefine how artisans and crafters see themselves. The science and technology sectors are thinking deeply and setting in motion forces that will hopefully sustain them through this next paradigm shift. So as evidenced by the exponential growth of websites like Etsy.com, and that's 17 million users and counting, and the online knitting website Ravelry, 2.5 million users and counting, craft is experiencing a generational surge not seen since the late 1960s and early 1970s. In fact, maybe we can say goodbye to craft. So with the current budget climate in elementary and secondary schools, art programs are being slashed even as career and technical education surges. So here's my basic question, and I'm not going to answer it. Will the craft world be content to experience the trickle-down effects of the maker movement and return to design-based solution in high schools, or will we offer up solutions of our own? Thank you.
Thank you, Garth. I think between this and the next segment, we're going to have quite a lively party discussion tonight. Actually, we have the privilege of welcoming three people to the stage. Neil Gershenfeld from MIT, Stuart Kestenbaum, who's director of Haystack, and Phyllis Klein, who is locally the director of the DC Fab Lab. And you'll see how well I think this dovetails with what Garth just talked about.
Great. Thank you. Is this on? Good. That's a great lead into what I'd like to talk about. And I'll sit still. I'm told I can't stride, which would help. When I was in high school, I wanted to go to the vocational school. That was cool. You could weld and fix cars and build houses. And I was told, no, you're smart. You have to sit in a room. And it seemed punitive. And I had a big fight with my parents. What does that have to do with it? And nobody could coherently explain to me why being smart meant you couldn't make things. And so I had to become an MIT professor and spend $20 million buying machines to find an answer. And so what I'd like to do now is talk about that answer and then hand off to two colleagues on the implications. I want to talk about the future of making things. The program I run at MIT, Center for Bits and Atoms, lives at the boundary of physical science and computer science, where you can't separate hardware and software. And one of the core themes emerging is this idea that we're at the edge of a digital revolution. Phones were analog. They got worse with distance. Claude Shannon at MIT wrote the best master's thesis ever and gave us digital communication, showing that an imperfect device could communicate perfectly, and now we have the internet. You wouldn't make an analog phone call to China. Computers were analog. That's one Vannevar Bush made at MIT. It's gears and pulleys, and it got worse. The answer was worse with time. A bigger group of people digitized computing, and now in your pocket you carry a supercomputer, what would have been considered a supercomputer. This is in 1952, MIT made the first computer-controlled milling machine. It was an early air defense computer connected to a machine tool to make aircraft parts too hard to make by hand. The most advanced 3D printers or laser cutters work the same way. A computer moves something around. The frontier in the research emerging is not a computer controlling a tool. It's actually putting the computing into the materials themselves, programming materials that contain information. That may sound abstract or semantic, but it has exactly the same implications as the difference between an analog and a digital telephone and an analog and a digital computer. So the digital revolution in fabrication hasn't happened. It's not the 1952 NC mill. It's something we're just at the edge. So in the research we're doing, there's a roadmap we're following from computers controlling machines to machines making machines, machines that make their own parts, to materials that contain codes, to materials that contain information. That's what the research looks like. And it's about 20 years to go through that map. I'm not going to talk about that today. If you're interested, tomorrow at the Philosophical Society, I'm doing a talk in the evening on the science behind this. Here I'll talk about the implications. Following that research roadmap, there's a very precise parallel with the history of computing. The machine from 1952, like the machines still in my lab today, are like mainframes, $1 million machines. You need a whole institution to use them. The Fab Labs I'll talk about, or the hackerspaces, spaces like that, are very analogous to mini computers. The second picture on my left, on the left, is one of my favorite pictures. That's Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie at Bell Labs inventing Unix. This is the moment when modern computing happened, hackers happened, email, video games, word processing, all happened then. And that's when a computer went from $1 million to $100,000. A work group could use it, so you didn't need approval from a whole organization. It wasn't a computer. There was a processing rack, there was a storage rack, there was a communication rack. It was hard to use. It was a bunch of different machines, but work groups could use them, and that's when the whole hacker community and the explosion of computing happened. And those are similar to these Fab Labs and hackerspaces, places like that. The Altair was the first hobbyist computer. It was life-changing for people like me. Now this was hundreds of dollars. The killer app for it was you could flip switches on the panel to load a binary program, and then the lights on the front panel would blink. Life-changing. And those are very similar to the machines that make machines. And where this is heading is the personal fabricator, which is like the PC. A 3D printer is not a personal fabricator. It makes a piece of plastic. The PC integrated storage, communication, processing, all these different functions in a system that let you do complete jobs. The personal fabricator will integrate all of these capabilities into one thing, and that's still doing it in one process cheaply and affordably. Is still many years of research to come. But the lesson from this parallel is you didn't have to wait 20 years to invent the internet. It happened in the PDP era. In the same sense, today we're in the equivalent of inventing the internet for this new technology. 20 years for it to all get integrated and the research to be done, but you can do it today. It's just a bit bigger and more cumbersome. And so I began to appreciate that. The $20 million was, I got funding from you through NSF, thank you, to set up a lab where roughly the proposal was I wanted one of every machine to make anything. And NSF on a good day said yes. And so we set that up, but I had all these machines from atomic nano assemblers to giant supersonic water jet cutters, but it would take a lifetime to learn to use them. So I started this class that was modestly aimed, called How to Make Almost Anything, that was just how to use all the machines, aimed at 10 or so research students, and hundreds showed up begging to take the class and saying, you know, this is so useful, are you allowed to teach it at MIT? And then the surprise is what they did. They did semester projects. Kelly made a device to save up screams and play it back later when it's convenient. That was a web browser for parrots that lets parrots talk to the other parrots, you know, surf the net. That was an alarm clock you have to wrestle with to prove you're awake. This is a dress instrumented with sensors and spines that defends your personal space. That was a self-flapping origami crane. These happened so consistently year after year that I began to appreciate two things. The students were answering a question I hadn't asked, which is, what is digital fabrication good for? The casual meaning of digital fabrication is digital designs becoming things in machines. The deep sense is coding the materials. I was asking how to do it. They were really answering what is it good for. So the first part of the answer is literacy, as we now understand it, emerged in the Renaissance. This was the trivium and the quadrivium, language, natural science. This is when the liberal arts emerged, where liberal was part of liberation. This was humanism, liberation through mastery of these means of expression. And at this moment, that's when there's this great notion of the illiberal arts. The illiberal arts were things for commercial gain. And that's when art and artisans separated. And so we're stuck with the notion of literacy based on the means of expression in the Renaissance. What the students were showing was 3D machining, microcontroller programming, is every bit as expressive as painting a painting or writing a sonnet, but they're means of expression that weren't available in the Renaissance. So the first piece of the answer was I couldn't go weld because of this mistake made a few hundred years ago, that we've frozen the notion of what literacy is. But in fact, the tools have radically changed, but they're every bit as expressive as you understand literacy. So there's this emergence of a new notion of literacy. And then in turn, this is slightly out of context, but this is Ken Olsen, the head of digital, which commercialized MIT's first computers that then gave us things like the internet, famously saying nobody needs a computer in the home. DEC is twice over bankrupt, bought by Compaq, bought by HP. You have computers in the home, but they're not for inventory and payroll. You have a computer in the home to do personal things, and that's sort of painfully obvious, but we're replaying the script. Why would you want machines in the home? The point of all those things I showed you was having manufacturing tools in the home isn't to make what you can buy at Walmart, it's to make what you can't buy at Walmart. It's to make invention for one person, just like you use a computer. So in the middle of the story, Congress passed legislation about measuring social impact. NSF had no idea how to do it, so they told us to measure social impact. We had no idea how to do it, but the one thing we knew was the tools were much more interesting than the stories. So we had adventurous program managers, and rather than telling people what we were doing, we thought it'd be more fun to give them the tools. And so millions of dollars on campus, 20 years to the Star Trek replicator. What we put together was about $50,000 or so in machines, $20,000 in materials, some custom software that would let you kind of do both what we do on campus and where it's heading. And we set up exactly one of these, and that was the project. But then these field Fab Labs started doubling about every year and a half. We're approaching 200 of them now. That was inner city Boston, rural India, that's the coast of Ghana. This is outside Pretoria in a township, that's in eastern Jalalabad. You can't wake up in Cambridge, Mass. And decide shanty towns in Africa need precision fab tools, but every time we open one of these, somebody else wanted one. In these, again, about the 50,000 in equipment, there's a large format tool that lets you make things like furniture, boats, bicycles, composites, precision tooling for things like circuit boards, molding, casting, soft tooling, laser cutter to press, fit, assemble 3D structures from 2D parts, sign cutter for printing masks, flexible circuits, antennas, 3D printers, 3D scanners, molding, casting, soft tooling, programming for embedded processors, sensors, actuators. So all of that lets you make a complete functional system. That's what's going to get smushed together in the research. And just as a note, in this emerging maker story, there's this bizarre meme about 3D printing. Once you have all of these, the least loved and least used tool typically is the 3D printer. All the press about the 3D printing revolution is written by people who don't actually use the tools. It's a bit like in 1950 telling cooks the future of cooking is a microwave oven. Sure, you use a microwave oven, but it's part of a well-equipped kitchen. In the same sense, all of these tools add up to making functional systems today. You can think of it in powers of 10. I have million-dollar research tools on the processes. Those get created with these $100,000 machines. Say 10 or so $100,000 machines is a well-equipped, state-of-the-art shop. The Fab Labs have 10 or so $10,000 machines that you could create with $100,000 machines. The Fab Lab is like the community library technical scale. Libraries aren't obsolete because you have books in the home. There's sort of a scale of what you do as a community facility. In turn, with the 10 or so 10K machines in a Fab Lab, you can make just about anything, and in particular, you can make machines. So the Fab Labs are enough to make machines like the third one down. That's about a $1,000 scale machine that you can use to make things like molding, casting, circuit boards. And so the $100,000 made out of 10 $10,000 machines lets you make the $1,000 machine, and a few of those add up to a lab. And in turn, there's this sort of hairy edge where with the $1,000 machine, you can make a $100 machine that works but doesn't yet work well. And so you can think about these as sort of powers of 10 in the capability. And the ones at the bottom are excited, but they don't replace the ones at the top. They're sort of a flow through capabilities. These are just a bunch of examples. The top is soft tooling for molding and casting, what I like much more than 3D printing. Using the laser cutter to make a press-fit boombox, using precision machining to make circuit boards, using the vinyl cutter to make flexural assembly. The large format mill, that was a big mono wheel. Composites, high-performance composites made out of old blue jeans. Those are examples of processes you can do with all of these tools. Just a quick glimpse of a few of them. In the middle of Amsterdam, there was an abandoned building, but iconic building, the old customs house. And so a group set up a Fab Lab there. So here's an example of a very important locally relevant project. It's a custom foosball table where they designed the furniture, insert molded the players. David played Darth Vader. They made the electronics to keep score. This was a lab in Barcelona of artists, architects, and designers who felt like the engineers just weren't getting it right, so they created a lab, most ambitiously for the last European Solar Decathlon. As a rapid prototyping project, they made a whole solar house, including the furniture in it. So this is a house as a rapid prototyping project. The biggest project they're doing is they're now running the city. 50% youth unemployment, whole generation being lost, and so they said, we have to do something. So they ran for and won the last election. And the connection is 50% unemployment, but you still buy products made in Shenzhen. They want to be globally connected for knowledge, but they're filling the city with these Fab Labs so you can be self-sufficiently locally for skills, jobs, and production. This is Phyllis's lab in DC. She'll tell you about one of the offshoots of projects like that. This is President Obama visiting one of the labs. Bill Foster, who 2 Congresses ago, he's a physicist in Congress, wrote this very interesting bill to take all these community labs and make it a new notion of a national lab. National labs struggle to have local impact. Let's make a national lab out of local labs. In the last Congress, he was beaten by a creationist. and Nana Boo Boo, he just won last night, or 2 nights ago. So Bill Foster's back in Congress to really run with this notion of a national NAB, national infrastructure made out of community labs. And then this is Stu's lab in Haystack that he'll tell you about. This was an artist was struck by the light on the main ocean. It was turned into a 3D mold to slump glass to make glass sparkle like the main ocean. Or hand drawings were turned into intaglio printing plates were examples of projects using that lab. In turn, there's a lot of work we're doing on machines that make machines and the software for them. If you're interested, I'll tell you about. You have to redo CAD, CAM, and machine control. There's this growing network that we've spun off of foundation funds. And then finally, I'll end with students coming through this just fall off an educational cliff. They're so far ahead of any opportunity. They get a message, you're smart, you have to leave now. And so we've started a Fab Academy, which is students have peers and work groups in these labs, then link globally with video and online content sharing. And you can sort of think of it this way. MIT is like a mainframe. You go there for processing. We can fit a few thousand people. A lot of attention to distance learning. That's like time sharing. You're a terminal connected to the mainframe. The Fab Academy functions like an internet. It's a network of sites where students have peers with mentors in work groups, but then they're linked globally. And what this is balancing is I adore the maker movement. On the other hand, I also cringe at things like Maker Faire because there's a lot of really stupid engineering where just a little bit of help would explain to somebody there's actually a much better way to do something that's been rediscovered many times over. And so the balance is to embrace the scalable, distributed learning empowered by these tools, but then provide a path to progress from easy to hard and mentor. And what it's ultimately leading to is the connection of digital communication, computation, and fabrication. In effect means rather than taking students to limited faraway campuses, you can in effect download the campus and tap much more of the brain power of the planet. And so I talk about some of the policy implications in this piece that just came out in Foreign Affairs. So that's what digital fabrication is and a little bit of the implications. And now, when I was asked to join this, the deal I made was to have Phyllis come talk about the local community setting and to have Stu talk about the arts and crafts setting. So now I'm going to hand off to them.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Phyllis, and I direct Fab Lab DC, the Fab Lab in our midst. And I'm so excited to be here for the Renwick's 40th birthday, and I wanted to thank Nicholas. And also, I'm having a senior moment. Thank you both for having us come today. Fab Lab DC is also celebrating an anniversary. It's our very first anniversary. We popped up this time last year. Thank you. We popped up this time last year. You see us nestled in the middle of a block on North Capitol Street. This is a transitional neighborhood. Part of the motivation for bringing Fab Lab here was not only to bring this wonderful asset to this local community and to DC and the region, but to jumpstart urban renewal and revitalization in this area. So we're 2 blocks from the New York Avenue Metro, and if you step outside onto our sidewalk and look southward, you will see the U.S. Capitol. So we were in a very lucky situation to meet Neil in 2010 and say we wanted to do this, and this was right at the time when Neil was working with Bill Foster to create the National Fab Lab Network. But I'll talk more about that in just a moment.
The right arrow. The right arrow.
So I've been invited today to talk with you about nation building in the context of the power of making and the Fab Lab project. And we all know that our nation is made up of thousands of communities, be they physical or virtual, where people are coming together around their interests to change things. Just like we're here today, making up the community. And I have to tell you that I know, I look out, I see many educators, students, makers, curators, thinkers, and thinkerers. You're a reflection of the Fab community. It's a blend of people from various backgrounds, educational experiences, ages. It's a very diverse community, and that's part of the excitement. And so there's questions being posed. Oh, sorry. There's questions being posed by the community about how to come together to solve problems. And some of the questions, as Neil has mentioned in his talk, are, if you could make anything, what would you make? What would you do? What problems can you solve? And these are the questions being asked in every lab, which extend beyond our nation to the global community. And it's so very fascinating to see what projects are emerging and how people are tackling not only unique local problems, but then that gives us a vantage to not only problems that are occurring elsewhere and the solutions, but how we might apply that to some of our own issues. And so you can walk into any Fab Lab, and through the magic of the internet and the Polycom, you can have a window into all of these labs all around the world, to the people, to the projects, to the places, that is, depending on the time zone and how late or early you're operating. And so if you're in Soshingovi and I'm in DC, and you're working on a project that you want to get in front of my group, or I want to bring your project here, you needn't send me the thing. You can send me the data, and with your permission, I can print it out on site, on demand. So this is an extraordinary opportunity to extend our capabilities, to extend opportunities. So this is a picture from Fab Lab DC. You can come to the labs. You can certainly do it yourself, but it's much more fun to do it with others. And so this is a picture of a workshop that we just had over the weekend, Arduino weekend, where it brought together, again, a diverse group of people, and the results were quite ingenious, but Neil limited me to only 12 slides, so I can't show you everything I want to show you. This is a photograph of the opportunity to also do it for others. And we had a pilot after-school program with some neighborhood kids who were given some parameters. They were asked to, some prompts. I like, I wish, what if? And they were then led through, I shouldn't say led, they were given the opportunity then to make prototypes based on some of those questions. So having the opportunity to open new opportunities for kids and others who otherwise may not have mentors, may not have windows to these new opportunities, is something else that happens at Fab Labs. We also have the opportunity to get ideas out in front of people, not just to get the ideas out, but to get feedback, collaborators, partnerships. Sometimes these ideas don't immediately manifest into things, but it's very important to keep the intellectual dialogue going. And really, I'm a little biased here, but it seems to me that there's an awful lot of talk about stimulus. And I think that Fab Labs are the ultimate stimulus packages. It takes stimulating individuals and groups and communities and ultimately our nation and ultimately us all as global citizens to really begin to step into what we need to do. So at Fab Lab DC, we're, as I said, a fledgling lab. We were supposed to get funding until Bill Foster got voted out, boo-hoo. So we've had to scramble, bootstrap. We get by having a lot of donations. We have our space donated right now, and we have workshops, exhibitions, speaker series, and events. And there's a lot going on. It's a lot of fun. So we're so thrilled that Bill Foster is back on the scene, because when we talk about community, the community extends beyond the people who are in the lab. The community extends to advocates and visionaries like Bill Foster and the renewed administration. The notion that there are pathways to changing paradigms. And so Of course, when you change one, you see how many others need to be changed, but consider that we can go beyond being merely consumers of technology to using technology as a medium for creative problem solving, a medium for personal expression. And this becomes the impetus for, wonderful means of invention. So there's a lot of support going now toward having maker spaces in junior high schools, libraries. The State Department's looking at incorporating this into their American centers. So it seems like there was a point where we went from being citizens to consumers. That's how we were counted. The town hall gave way to the local mall. But Fab Labs are a way to re-engage with the community, almost with a civic purpose. You don't always know who you're going to find when you walk through the door. You might come to do it yourself, you might come with your own group, but ultimately you become part of a bigger network and a bigger purpose. And this is a grand appeal to many of our members. It takes resources to run a Fab Lab, but people aren't waiting for the government to catch up to us. And so there's a lot of hacking and bootstrapping and innovation going on. And I have to wrap it up. So please visit us, go to our website, send me an email, and come by and see what's happening. Thank you.
I want to issue a disclaimer and say I didn't put that dissolve on it. Neil did.
I didn't. They did.
Nobody even knows why it happened. That's the way it is with technology sometimes. But
I guess they is the machine, not the people.
Maybe I can kill it with a laser pointer. Anyhow, so I wanted to talk to you about Haystack and our relationship with digital technology, which goes back about 11 years or so. And Haystack, as many of you may know, is an international craft school. We have intensive workshops during the summer months. It's snowing right now, so we're not having any workshops. And they generally deal with process, creative process, and materials, and intensive workshops where people can work 24 hours a day if they want for generally a 2-week session, and with that intensive relationship with time, really make breakthroughs with their work. We've augmented that with conferences and shorter symposia to examine craft in kind of a larger context. We started in 1950 as a research and studio program in the arts, and then 21 years later, the Renwick came along. And so I'll just take you on a little tour of the school, and then it was on our 21st birthday. That's an aerial view. We're in Deer Isle, Maine, far away from Washington, D.C., and that is our landscape, an amazing landscape formed by the last glacier. To put that in perspective, it was 14,000 years ago, and you've only been here since noon. The campus was designed by Edward Larrabee Barnes, noted American architect, and it received an award from the American Institute of Architects called the 25-Year Award that's given to a building or a group of buildings that have had a significant impact on design and maintain their design significance. So other buildings that share that award are the Guggenheim Museum, Rockefeller Center, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, but we were the only one that was built for $5 a square foot, which I think says something about craft and that you don't need all the money to make something special. So here's some of our workshops. We have workshops in ceramics, in metals, textiles, glass blowing. This is what the campus looked like when it was being built. A very light impact on that glacial landscape, so the whole campus kind of hovers above the ground. And this is our new Fab Lab, which we built well, this was a building that was built in 2004, but after a series of visits by Neil, we were able to raise the money not from DARPA, not from MIT, but from an anonymous foundation that helped support it. So we built a new building. But our involvement with digital technology began in 1999. A man named Mitch Resnick was visiting the Haystack campus, and Mitch is with the Media Lab at MIT, and he has a program called the Lifelong Kindergarten, is what his research group is called. And I said, he was there to teach a group of not at Haystack, but in Stonington, high school teachers how to do computer programming and elementary school teachers that they could do with kids. And he said he was from MIT, and so I immediately said in an unenlightened way, well, I don't think we have that much in common. And he said, I think you'd be surprised, we do. And then that was the end of the conversation. A few years later, we decided we wanted to investigate this idea of the digital world, meaning our hands, that people in the craft world use, and the digital world of computers. And so I had a contact at MIT, a woman named Diane Willow, and we began to want to look at the digital divide. And so we wanted to have a symposium called Digital Dialogues, Technology in the Hand. After probably a 2-year gestation, we had the conference in 2002, and we invited people from MIT. Neil wasn't one of them, although I did meet Neil at the time. It was the first paperless meeting I'd been to. We were trying to plan an event, and everybody looked at their calendars, and I was the only one who had a paper calendar, and I'm still the only one who has a paper calendar. But in that symposium, we paired somebody with a digital background and somebody with a craft background in a studio. In addition to having people speak about the topic, we wanted to manifest that through a studio. So in blacksmithing, we had Tom Joyce, a MacArthur Award-winning sculptor and blacksmith, and Justine Cassell, who was at MIT then, whose field was narrative psychology. And they were working on a project together. They decided to make a vessel that would tell of its own making. So you'd reach in and there'd be sensors that would show as you reached your hand in how the rivets were made and how they were done. And as people were working on this project, I thought having MIT come to Haystack was kind of, if Haystack had gone to MIT, we would have been, I think, probably ignored, it's safe to say. But when everybody from MIT came up, we had the home field advantage. And so, but I began to see as people were working together with the red glow of the forge, you know, the most ancient technology, and then there were some people from MIT, doctoral students, who were working on their laptops. There's that blue light of the screen. That there wasn't a divide between how people are creative, that it was a continuum of creativity that went from the ancient fires of blacksmithing to the blue fires of computer screens today. And to me, that was a pivotal moment in seeing the kind of creativity and ingenuity that's between, and that's in common with all those fields. So we began a more intensive relationship with MIT, and I had visiting artists. Chris Cheeksent-Mahai was a visiting artist, Diane Willow, and then I invited Neil to speak at a conference called Making Past, Present, and Future. Neil is a really hard person to get a hold of, but I'm not that smart, but I'm really tenacious. So I probably took about a month of phone calls, emails, phone calls, emails, phone calls. I was about to give up, and he appeared like William Shatner. He just appeared right before me. No, we actually emailed, and he said he'd come for the conference, and it was a 4-day conference. He said, well, I'll come, but I'll tell you what, I'll bring a lab with me. So they brought most of the equipment that he showed you that's in the lab. We had a great 4 days. We began to realize we could have a really interesting relationship because we deal with materials in a certain way that many of the other labs don't, I think, in terms of makers' sensitivity to the actual physical materials of clay and metal. And so Neil left a laser cutter as an engagement present. It was an old one. It had caught on fire a couple of times, but still was a really nice present. And invited Neil back the next year to be a visiting scientist for 2 weeks, and he brought people from MIT with him, and we set up a lab in what had been our visiting artist studio. It went so well, we said, let's do a lab. We talked about it. We had a funder at the same time, and so we could put together the lab that you see now. So during the summer months, the way it works is students who are working, our faculty who are working on projects can use the lab to complement and augment a studio practice. So it's not a standalone lab. It's an extension, a creative extension of the way that you might work. That's Kenny Chung, who's a doctoral student, and he was working with Jen Jlocki, who was a visiting artist. So they were making press-molded, press-fit modules for her basket structures that she makes. This was a piece that Joe Wood, who's at Mass Art, worked on this summer when he taught a workshop that involved using CAD design. And that's the piece that he made. So increasingly, we're finding that there's a whole generation of studio makers who are familiar with this technology. So where 10 years ago would have been really unusual, now it's a very fluid fit with many of the people we're inviting to teach workshops. So they're really familiar with it. So it's a really exciting interface for us in that way. And these are just some shots of the equipment at work. using real craft materials. That's our 3D printer, and there's a 3D haystack. You see it? And you take that, you just add water, and a campus will grow wherever you put it. This was an interesting project with Richard Notkin. You're probably familiar with Richard's work. He makes tile pieces about this size. We used, that's the milling machine, which they used as a 3D scanner, which then they could use on the shop at the larger piece of equipment. So Richard could make, we cut out in rigid styrofoam that same mold, but much, much larger. So he could really change the scale of his work, and it's a very interesting application for us. And here's some of the samples of the kinds of things that we do. You can use it for printmaking, you can make molds, you can change the scale of the molds that you make. The blue styrofoam piece was made by Neil's son, Eli, when he was 12. And it's all, so a whole range of projects, and we just give those as samples to people to give them a sense of what they're able to do.
It ends there.
It ends there. So what I find is vital for us is not just having equipment, because there is a lot of equipment around that's like this. And my head spins when Neil talks. It didn't go all the way around this time because I knew not to do that in front of you, but in terms of the implications of how things work. But what I really treasure is this idea that our creativity is not, that we're all in this together as a creative family, in a sense. And that when we have the doctoral students from MIT staying up at night working on a lathe or making a pot when they're assisting people during the day, that we're in a kind of conversation and a dialogue. So I really treasure that relationship. So it's not really, it's about the equipment because you need that, but I think it's about the minds and how they work together. And the other thing for me is to remember that to use the appropriate technology for the project. So sometimes that could be a laser cutter, other times it could be a pair of scissors. And to always know what's the appropriate technology to use has been a good thing for us to realize. And I think that gives you enough of our information.
That's great. So I'm going to wrap up just with two very short stories. When we set up the lab at Haystack, for the first time, the first summer, it was like Dylan going electric at Newport. Half the people there were just outraged, horrified. You know, we do craft here. This is a temple of the hand. How dare you bring in these machines? They're deadening. They're going to kill what we do. Really, really upset. The other half of the people that were really upset at the people who are really upset, saying, you must be kidding yourself. Glass blowing, blacksmithing is technology. It was the most advanced technology of the day. It's all technology. This is just different technology. So big polarized fight. But in the middle of it, the lab was such a success. There were people literally in tears at this life-changing experience of realizing things they could never, realizing literally coming to blows over who got to use the shopbot next. But the lesson for me was the computer appeared almost never as the design tool. The lab was used as a media transformation device. You could turn something into something you couldn't have done before. The light on the main ocean into sparkling glass, or an ink doodle into a large metal press. It was used to convert things in ways you couldn't have done before, where it's full of technology internally, but at the beginning and the end, it's a very organic process. And so in the end now, the second summer in, I kind of would ask people, and they look at me blankly about the controversy. It's like, well, of course there's a Fab Lab, you know, just we all use it. And sort of it's completely dissipated. It's now kind of ancient history. The memory of that as being a polarizing force was one story. And then the second story was running the lab. I had this horrible experience of every single artist, essentially, who would come in and say, I want to make this on that, would break some assumption in our workflow. All the combinations of what they wanted to start with and what they wanted to come out with just weren't reflected in how we thought engineering workflows work. And so they so consistently kept breaking our software. At MIT, I bought expensive software to run the machines. At Haystack, I was sort of at the whims of this bizarre environment. And so the end result was I started a project there to rewrite the software internals to accommodate this explosion of demand. And then it's had a big back action. The project that started just coding at Haystack to make the things for the artists grew into a much larger project, redoing CAD/CAM internals. And now we're working with a number of the leading software vendors and machine makers on commercializing these kind of new software workflows. But we wouldn't have done them ourselves. They came from working with the artists. And so it's important to see that this isn't just simply a unidirectional flow, there's a real back action from these sort of collaborations back into the life of the technology. So with that, we'll wrap up and be happy to take questions. Thank you.
We're actually not real, we're copies of ourselves.
I have a quick question about just what is the implication of art at a place like MIT, having had this experience of I guess, bridging this, quasi-divide between artists and scientists? Is there a real-life application besides just rewriting and recoding software for your students and for, kids who have had no previous, doctoral students who are brilliant maybe, but have absolutely they don't have art in some way?
Well, boy, so there are countless billion-dollar investments in innovation programs and universities that have failed. MIT, it's created $2 trillion in businesses and all the Nobel Prizes. By a number of measurements, it succeeds. If you look at MIT, there's nothing special about the facilities, there's nothing special about the budget, it's all the culture. MIT is kind of a safe place for strange people where they finally fit. And key to your question is, within MIT, there are some distinguishable arts programs, but creative expression, exactly as you understand it, is so integral to the environment. I don't know anybody at MIT who doesn't do creative expression with the tools. Some of the time they're doing research, some of the time they're hacking for the fun of it. A lot of the time they're making beautiful things and expressive things. And that sense of expression in the medium is so integral to the culture. There was this amazing hack where the students took the tallest building on the campus and turned it into a display. They put computer-controlled lights in every single window so you could project images all over the building. It was this amazing engineering feat. They played video games on it, and they just made beautiful things out of the building. And so,
I guess I have a follow-up then, because I asked the wrong question.
Yeah.
What's the trickle-down effect for students, people who can never experience MIT and who can never experience Haystack? Because I teach at a large, urban, poor public university in Texas, and I have mostly working class non-white students who are never going to get to experience this kind of equipment. So what is the how will this trickle down?
So here's the sort of question back to you then. If you look at an environment like MIT, play, expression, research just aren't separated. It's practical, it's serious, it's silly, it's all tangled up, and that's what makes it work. One of the successes of these Fab Labs and Hackerspaces and Makerspaces and all of them is, on a small scale, they replicate this notion of being sort of safe places for strange people, where you can be expressive and tinker in the environment. So for me, the heart of your question is, we've had to create things like the Fab Academy and these maker education initiatives because it's so hard to change the sort of trillion-dollar mothership of the school establishment. So this works, and we know how to do it. I think a big looming question is, can the tail wag the dog and can we change the school systems? Or are we, in effect, creating a new educational system? And one step further at this level of the vocational education, in the Fab Academy, we made a conscious decision just to give up and do a do-over. That so many of the assumptions of how it's done today were so limiting, we're creating our new infrastructure. So we know how to do this affordably at scale in a community setting. The question is the vector going to be through the existing schools, or are we going to create a new structure? That's a big kind of question hanging around this now.
Hi, I have a true confession. I'm married to a guy who went to MIT, and he was an English major, and dropped out after 2 years, transferred because he was just couldn't deal with his fellow classmates who liked to play chess in their heads. So sometimes there's a little too much weirdness at MIT. But that's not my question.
That was a statement, right?
That's my statement.
Yeah.
It was very interesting to hear and to see the demonstrations of the labs themselves. I'd like to hear a little bit more, maybe an executive summary of some of the discussions that might be going on about how to move the labs into the next stage. In other words, you're trying to encourage people to think differently about materials and processes. How do you translate that into an entrepreneurial venture? Where do you find the money? How are these kids going to find the money to create these things later on?
So I'll comment on that. I don't want to answer all the questions, so please chime in when you have something to say. But as these labs spread, those projects I showed you could make good businesses. And so we did this sort of obvious thing. We would take a inventor with a cool thing, we would pair them with an entrepreneur to create business. Miserable failure. The entrepreneurs felt like the inventors weren't following their instructions. The inventors felt like the entrepreneurs weren't telling themselves anything useful. And what was going on underneath was the entrepreneurs were kind of replaying the script from the last war, not the next war. What we found is beginning to succeed, and it's just beginning, for the financial sustainability, is pretty much across the board we've had to recreate all of the organizations. Because digital fabrication slices across aid, education, research, play, art, that are traditionally segregated, we found to make it sustainable, we need to create entirely new kinds of organizational capacity. So one kind of business is education. We've created these new education platforms. One kind of business is business, but here you go to market not by making a product, but by shipping data and producing it on demand. But to do that, you need a business platform that lets you source on demand locally, but link it globally. And those business platforms didn't exist. There you need to create these entirely new infrastructure for buying and selling. One of the most interesting kind of businesses coming out of these labs is actually not selling things, but it's selling services associated with the things. In fact, going back to your story, one of my favorite labs run by Blair Evans in Detroit is a social service where he takes juvenile delinquents and teenage pregnancy. They come to the lab, and what he's selling is by teaching them to make stuff, but in this sense, they have much better life outcomes. And so my answer to the question is, it's sort of linking to the other question. In the same way, MIT and Kendall Square and Stanford and Silicon Valley isn't narrowly about making money. It's sort of a side effect of this engine. What we're finding is for these to be financially sustainable, there's a whole slew of new organizations we need to reflect how the technology works. The obvious incumbents just don't do it.
They're also, each lab kind of has a particular kind of focus, and there's some really exciting things in some of the labs, like in India, where they make prosthetics for kids. In Afghanistan, they're making providing high-speed internet access to rural villages. In fact, when Neil came to Haystack and we have slow internet, he wanted to do the same thing, and we'd have to have taken down all the trees on Deer Isle to make that happen. But there's a kind of vitality locally, I think, that's happening that is very exciting, and it's and really transformative for those communities.
So we're almost out of time. Let's quickly go through a couple questions.
Mine is related to the first two, so I think I'm going to pass.
Okay.
Oh, guys, I just had a question that's been bugging me ever since I found out about this whole phenomenon. I think a lot of people look at digital fabrication and personal fabrication in the future as perhaps a solution to mass manufacturing and all the ills that we see in a global economy where things are shipped across the world constantly and made at great scale. Do you actually think that personal fabrication will replace scaled manufacturing, and if so, when?
Yeah, the answer to that can be said with great certainty based on the precision of the historical parallel with music and software. In software, there's a string of bits that becomes a program. Software was done by IBM or Microsoft. Now with smartphones and apps, we have this ecology of programs for 1, 10, 100, 1,000, a million. There's still Windows 8, But arguably, Windows 8 is the least interesting part of software. The most interesting is the stew of apps for much smaller markets that percolate there and grow. In the same sense, music is a string of bits that become a sound. That music was done by the labels, or you just had to do everything by yourself. Now, with the digital music tools, many more people can produce music, and with things like iTunes, you still have Lady Gaga, but arguably that's the least interesting part of music. The most interesting part is the music for markets of 1, 10, 100, 1,000. And so in the same sense, digital fabrication, a string of data becomes a thing. There'll still be mass manufacturing. It doesn't make sense to personally fabricate a washer because there's no value added in that. Mass manufacturing will make things where everybody needs the same things, and it's just economy of scale. That won't go away. But what's going to come is this ecology of markets of 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 that didn't exist before, and that's where much of the ferment and activity will be. And some things will flow through that from small to large. And so replay the script of app stores and MP3 tracks, and it's really just exactly the same thing. Data becomes a program, data becomes a sound, data becomes a thing, and all the things you think of apply. The only difference is for the MP3 story to work, you needed a portable music player. Here you needed the machine. And what's happening is the machine is becoming as accessible as the music player. So it's very analogous to that.
I might add that recently there was a conference at Stanford. It was called Fab Learn 2012. And there, Paula Blickstein is doing a lot of research about the fab phenomena in schools and how we learn, how children learn. And one of the projects that they did rendered the conclusion that when kids make something themselves, even if they're just adding something on to an existing, say, garment or product, they used it more. It had more meaning for them. And so then you can get into these notions about, the disposable things we make. If personalizing them makes them more valuable and less likely to be, wasted, there's value in that as well.
Okay, this is the last question.
Hi, my name is Anna Chiftan. I'm a professor of ceramics at SUNY New Paltz. And our ceramic students travel between the ceramics studio and the Fab Lab that we have all the time. And I wanted to share that one of the questions that we ask is this dialogue between technology and material and will inspire our imagination in a different way that we understand the material and the creative process. So we're kind of curious, how do we get beyond, yes, the machine can print that, and we can see that it's machine printed, to that point where we're using it as another set of our language skills without kind of being so connected to technology, to that moment where it becomes automatic. I think it's a little bit maybe analogous to when Photoshop came and people started doing art on Photoshop, and you said, oh yeah, that's art made on Photoshop. And now things are made on Photoshop and we don't know, it's just art. Yeah. And so I just wanted to share that we ask our students, and I think it's an interesting thing to talk about, is how these processes will inspire the sort of that place that we'll get to that we don't know what it looks like because of that dialogue.
So if I could, let me give you just two little bullets. In the Fab class at MIT, I teach how to make anything. There's such a mismatch between students who want to take it and what I can fit. I have to carefully pick from student applications. And what I do is I pick one of everything. So serious, silly, art, engineering. And one of the things that's so much fun for me is watching the artists teach the engineers about engineering and watching the engineers teach the artists about art. It just works like clockwork, that they each learn about what they do from the other ones. And so, my answer to your question is the early days of 3D printing and using Arduinos is like lots of bad fonts on a page. You have to get beyond that by raising literacy. I'm trying to do that through things like this class at MIT and these labs where you learn one of every tool and smush people together, and that works. But the question is now how to scale it. So there's some very interesting discussions now about how to take that experience we can do in these selected spaces, but linking a number of these questions, do it times a billion people. I'd come back to smushing people together with the tools, with the diverse backgrounds, with mentorship, does what you're asking for. Challenge now is how do we build the sort of organizational structures that allow us to scale that? Stu, were you going to say something?
You were going to say something else?
Oh, I just wanted to say another thing, that there were questions about how the Fab Labs come not through your movement, and to just share that about 10 years ago we just said, oh, we're really curious how this technology will inspire the students' imagination. And we were just very persistent. And SUNY New Paltz is not a very wealthy school, nor is it as a research school. But I have seen the lab that is at Haystack, and ours is equivalent and very, very active.
Great.
And it's happening, so that's great.
Thank you very much to this final session for today. I think it's remarkable. And thank you all for sticking with us through the day. I know it's been a very long day, but I hope you found it enriching. We pick up again tomorrow morning at 10:30. In the meantime, let's head upstairs. We've all earned a drink and some food. And I'll see you up there.
Thank you. Thank you.